Right. Look, a very warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen, on an extremely cold night. Thank you so much for coming out. It's going to be an exciting evening. We have two wonderful speakers, and I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and we acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging, and give thanks for the stewardship and custodianship of the land on which we're meeting, this very beautiful piece of Australia. And we give thanks for the tens of thousands of years that they have cared for this beautiful part of Australia. Christians for an Ethical Society is an ecumenically based forum which seeks to engage with ethical challenges of the contemporary world, nationally, locally and internationally. We are a community of Christians and others committed to look at issues of justice, the common good, harmony in a sustainable world, and we draw from our Christian's foundation, the Bible, Revelation, and particularly the prophetic tradition. That tradition calls for both religious and secular leadership to respect the whole created order, to give voice to the voiceless, and dignity to the downtrodden. We believe, Christians for an Ethical Society, that Christianity is more than personal piety. It impacts on how we live together, how we structure our society and community, what's its raison d'etre, and what are its values that undergird the way we live. CES gives thanks for its association with the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture. Tonight, Stephen Pickard was to be chairing this session. I'm the co-chair with Stephen, and tonight Stephen is in Wagga Wagga with an important discussion taking place in relation to the future of the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture, so he sends his apologies. We are delighted that we can work together in partnership with the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture. This year, we see as focusing on values and voices in the public sphere. In the first session, we looked at media and social networking with Professor Seamus Miller, with a response from Tony Hassel. In March, we looked at the Royal Commission's report into aged care, and Lynn Hadford-Dodds and Gordon Ramsay, who have been our former legislative member for aged care, spoke on that evening. Tonight, we are looking at climate change. As an introduction, I'm very encouraged by the words of the former governor of both the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada, Mark Carney, who gave the 2020 BBC Reith Lectures. And he said in reference to COVID-19 that in this crisis we know we need to act as an interdependent community, not independent individuals, so that the values of economic dynamism and efficiency have been joined by that of fairness, responsibility and compassion. Tonight, we're addressing the issue of climate change and have two very capable speakers. Before I introduce them, I'll just alert you to the fact that our annual dinner is taking place on the 17th of August at the Athletic Club. We'll be having our speaker that night will be Genevieve Jacobs, AM. Genevieve will be speaking on the way in which the media influences our values. Our format this year has changed. We have a shorter speaker, so George will be speaking in a minute, followed by David, so there'll be a response. Following that, there'll be the opportunity to ask questions, and I would ask you to come to the microphone. And I would ask that they be questions rather than speeches. Tonight, is it just me, asked the frog, or is the water getting warmer? Tonight we're very privileged to have Bishop George Browning, Dr. Browning, who was Bishop of the Anglican Bishop of this diocese from 1993 to 2008, a 15-year period. During that time, George maintained a high profile, and particularly on issues of the environment. He, with Sir William Dean and Luigi O'Donoghue, helped in the founding of the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture. The building across the road is named in honour of George Browning. In 2000, he was awarded the Australian Centenary Medal for his contribution to the community. In 2005, George became the convener of the Anglican Communion on the Environment Network and created the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change. After retiring, George never retires, George completed a VTH with honours at St Mark's and through Charles Sturt University, a PhD, which was on the ethical response to climate change from the biblical concept of Sabbath. He's published his book on that subject. It's called Sabbath and the Common Good. More recently, a few weeks ago in this chapel, another book was launched. This is called Not Helpful, Tales of a Truth Teller, which is a mixture of George's reflections on his personal life, and I encourage you to try and get hold of a copy. So we look forward very soon to George speaking to us. Our responder will be David Hunter. David, like George, has also been a president of Christians for an Ethical Society. David is an eminent scientist in his own right. He is the international president of the Orthopterist Society. And how many people know what they are? What an orthopterist? Well, they're locusts and grasshoppers and related insects. And David is sought after to provide wise counsel on the scientific basis of what's happening to the climate. So, welcome to everyone tonight, to our two speakers, and now I invite George to speak. Thank you.
Thanks, Clive, very much. I too would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, their elders past, present and emerging, and to give thanks for their contribution over centuries to this land. First of all, my goodness, I was actually psychologically ready for myself to be here, Clive to be here, David to be here, and maybe one or two others, given the temperature today. So that so many of you are here, I feel honoured that you've come out. This is not a conventional address on climate change. I'm taking it from an entirely different perspective. I feel that David will cover it, I'm sure, but I don't know that we need much more convincing about the science. The scary thing is that the science is so clear that it's almost unbelievable that people still want to argue against it. There was some good news today, by the way. I was listening in the car coming up from the coast that a judge in the Netherlands has decreed that Shell is responsible for its emissions and will actually have to account for them and actually have to reduce its emissions very substantially over the next decade or so. And the feeling is that that has set a precedent for other legal challenges in the future, which is really quite exciting. And Exxon and others watch out for what's coming next. I was also pleased that the case against Susan Lay, taken by 7 children in Australia, actually won the case in court. Not that it makes much difference to anything, but the fact that the judge listened to their case favourably and said that the Minister for the Environment was responsible to care for the future of the children, I thought was a great outcome. Not that it'll make any slightest bit of difference to our policies, I'm sure. I'm going to tell you what my argument tonight is. That tonight I'm going to argue that the circumstances in which humanity now finds itself is of such gravity that we actually have to evolve, and that there is a tipping point for humanity. We either grasp it and we survive, or we fail to grasp it and we go down. And I'd like to concentrate on humanity rather than the climate itself. Those of you who know me from years ago know that I seldom speak from notes, but I have got them tonight, so I'm going to read them. So my title is, as Clive said, "Is it just me?" asked the frog, "or is the water getting warmer?" No, little frog, I'm afraid it is not just you, nor any other amphibian, or invertebrate, or mammal, or sea creature, or rainforest, or open savanna, or eucalypt, or orchid. It is getting warmer, and all are under immediate and direct threat, or, more seriously, under indirect and more gradual threat, easily ignored because it is gradual. The latter is more serious because 1 minute to midnight appears to provide for we humans ignorant and dangerous latitude for non-action or change of direction. Many of those at the top of the food chain, that's us, remain lulled into false security, while others sullenly refuse to see and measure what is now in plain sight. It is impossible, really, to argue reasonably that you can't see what is so clear. Some humans realise, while many still fail to recognise, that changed circumstances dictate that we have now reached a tipping point in human evolutionary history. Fail to evolve, and we fail to survive. The 21st century could well prove to be the nadir of human history, not its technological triumph. Humans love to speak of the tipping points in nature, moments when change becomes irreversible and consequences spew out over previously immune territory, like the effect on ocean and coastal communities as polar ice caps significantly melt. The human tipping point is forced upon us by the reality that we exist in short time frames, while the planet exists in vast eons of time. Our influence and impact has made the planet succumb to our time frames. Ecological change that used to take eons is now happening quite rapidly, especially since the advent of the Industrial Revolution. Despite this, the planet will survive. Its future is not at stake. It will change and evolve slowly over millennia, as it always has. The question is, will we humans change course within a time frame that will protect our future? Or, like lemmings, will we continue a path that leads to our collapse? Unfortunately, history is not on our side, as Jared Diamond has chronicled very carefully and well in his seminal work called Collapse. If you haven't read it, I suggest you do. Our tipping point has been reached through our own actions. We are not victims of some unseen force. Until a few decades ago, we could build our social structures, our economic structures, even our intimate family structures, as we always have, in a competitive, tribal view of the world. This is the way it has always been. belonging to a tribe lies deep within our DNA. Being cast from the tribe always meant certain death. Medieval Europe, in which barons ruled and peasants served, even though unjust and grossly unequal, was in a strange way successful tribalism, for in it each benefited from the other. All could be expected to fight on behalf of the tribe in its conflict with other tribes. What was good for the tribe was good for me. Indeed, I could benefit from the diminishment of another tribe. In the last 2 centuries, tribalism has reinvented itself on the international scene as aggressive nationalism. Having evolved to believe our well-being and security is deeply rooted in tribal allegiance and advantage, 20th century nationalism has spawned dreadful violence, injustice and inequality. Through colonisation, war, economic slavery of others, including children, the raping of scarce resources and environmental vandalism, humanity has left the planet in a perilous position. So, what is this evolutionary tipping point about which I'm referring? To survive, we must now abandon overt and covert tribalism and accept planetary citizenship. No nation or group of people can any longer claim the right to choose advantage for themselves that harms the planet's balance and long-term sustainability and escape the consequences. For Christians, that should not be hard to comprehend or embrace. While it is essentially what we have always believed, it is clearly not what we have practiced. We have been and are as tribal as any other community. When true to ourselves, male and female, we Christians believe we are Adam of the earth. It is not our role to conquer and subdue, but to be sentient servants, ones who know how to behave appropriately within a balanced and stable ecological cycle of which we are necessarily a part. For millennia, human continuity was fragile. Conquering and subduing was necessary to survive the onslaughts humans have always experienced. Just by the way, it is my view that that difficult piece in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 relates to this matter. The creation stories are largely ideological, and so for the vast majority of human history, subduing and conquering has been necessary for human survival. And without that subduing and conquering, humans would not have been able to survive. And so you have this commission in the creation story, which is now somewhat embarrassing to environmentalists who read it, to require humans to actually do that. And I think we need to understand that verse in this context. This was necessary. One of the great principles of the Old Testament is that we live in such a way that we support the survival of the next generation, the next 7 generations, the next 10, 20, 200 generations. Anyway, this ideological story in Genesis reflects this reality. For the survival of future generations, forces alien to humanity had to be overcome. Not anymore. Our very success is the reason for the threat we now face. Through the rapid explosion of our population, together with our resource-dependent prosperity, we have inflicted fragility on the whole planet. In the first book, one of the arguments I make is that while population expansion was in a way a principle laid down in the Old Testament that we needed to keep the children of the next generation going, in order to maintain the future of the next generation, today we need to do the reverse. We actually, to breed more children today, is to put the future of the next generation at threat. We have been provided with a rhythm, a Sabbath rhythm of rest and renewal, which we have largely or totally ignored. We Christians also believe we are because of what others are. In our belief system, there is actually no space to think individually. That might be somewhat of a surprising statement, but I believe it to be the case. We are community beings, embraced in our common humanity and redeemed in our common Christ-likeness. Our identity is shaped by our place in the body. I am, as Desmond Tutu says, the total of all the lives that have intersected with my own. So, this tipping point for humanity should not come as a surprise to Christians. It is the evolutionary change that Christ wrought in us and for us, but which we have failed to embrace. The more so post the Enlightenment, when the illusion of individual human rights and freedom from restriction became a tantalizing El Dorado. In fact, it is the exaltation of the individual that has led to a dysfunctional pandemic marked by alienation and a mental health crisis. The real El Dorado is actually in plain sight. It is rediscovered through embracing the limitations that all life-giving relationships demand. To live harmoniously with others, with the natural order, indeed with oneself, is to discover again one's appropriate place. To exceed that place, as humanity has done qualitatively and quantitatively, is to court fission and the release of destructive, violent energy. It is ironic, and I think Clive referred to this, it is ironic that this last year's COVID pandemic has led us falteringly down the path of shared responsible behaviour nationally and internationally. A path that in other circumstances might be described as socialistic. We have learned that if we insist on exercising rights we assume to reside in individuals or nations, then we exacerbate an already deadly problem. We have needed to set aside the right to do as we please and conform to behaviour that has been shown to be in the best interests of one another. Further, we have discovered we are as strong as our weakest link. If one Australian state failed, then all other states were shut down. If one individual or group of individuals behaved irresponsibly, then potentially thousands of others suffer. We have come also to realise that in a global pandemic, assisting the weakest and least resourced nations is vital. No country on the planet will be safe from the pandemic until all countries on the planet are safe from the pandemic. Put it slightly differently, as I am going to do in relation to Palestine, no one is free until everybody is free. The other side of the equation may have come as a surprise to many, namely that the economy, the gold standard of human success or failure in a neoliberal capitalist world, has prospered when practices that are at heart socialistic are adopted when crisis prevails. So, What are the implications for humans everywhere in this great tipping point in human evolution as it relates to social, economic, and intimate personal practice in response to the environmental crisis? First, the individual. We, that's all of us, must embrace practices that might otherwise be called socialistic. We must all act for good that is common. In a world which challenges are global, good that is not common cannot be sustained. In a neoliberal world, good or wealth generated by an individual is believed to trickle down to serve good that is common. That has proved to be an illusion. In the world we have now entered, good that is common will trickle up if we allow it and are open to it. We know that what we hold in common is infinitely more significant than any wealth we may possess as an individual. It is no longer possible for individuals to seriously proffer the excuse, "We did not know." Within our own circumstance, and according to ability, all of us must adopt a carbon-neutral position at home, work and play, not just in 2050, but this year. We must all research the best way to source sustainable products, use less plastic, sort our waste into easily recyclable units, and above all, only use renewable energy. We must all act and plan with the future in mind, not least with the future of our planet's children in mind. Well within the next decade, all of us should be driving an electric vehicle, preferably powered with the energy from our own solar system on our house. If you haven't ridden in an electric vehicle, please do. It's such fun. Unbelievable power. It's extraordinary. Within the next 10 years, all of us, I think, should be connected to a mini-grid. Mini-grids will become ubiquitous in neighbourhoods where renewable energy is shared from neighbouring properties. Pressure must be put on the government instrumentalities for adequate investment to be made into the grid to make it 21st century fit for purpose. That household generators of electricity are now being threatened with the possibility of paying rather than being paid for energy exported to the grid makes it abundantly clear that the grid is no longer fit for purpose. All of us should strategize towards zero waste. Almost everything should be recyclable. 2, economies. Now for maybe the biggest call in my paper. Because of its underlying assumptions, unredeemed, neoliberal capitalism will destroy the planet this century unless it is reformed. Neoliberal capitalism assumes that privatising is necessarily good, that wealth trickles down. It assumes good practice minimises or eliminates cost and maximises profit. It assumes that regulation should be avoided and that deregulation will necessarily guarantee an appropriate balance between supply and demand. It assumes that through supply and demand, the market levels off equitably. None of this is true. This can be best illustrated by the refusal of neoliberal politicians to count environmental cost in the cost of production. It is reasonable to assume that if damage is done as the result of an action, reparation should be made. The damage done in the harvesting of fossil fuels through the release of greenhouse gases needs no further proof or argument. It is reasonable to include the cost in tabulating the cost of production. Neoliberal politics refuses to do so and calls such accounting a tax. It is not a tax. A tax is the imposition of a levy which is external to the costs involved in a particular enterprise, like the GST. Expecting open-cut miners to restore the land or coal-fired power stations to pay for the release of CO2 is no more, but no less, than expecting them to pay for all the elements implicit in their production. Industries and companies that make money out of planet-destroying business models will fight ferociously to maintain their right to stay in business. As I've said, the court in Holland has erred in favour of the environment and against the producer. Political leaders who are wedded to a neoliberal economic system will support these businesses, as we see from our Australian situation. No business should be allowed, let alone championed, when its business model is predicated on negative outcomes for the planet. The planet will survive without us. We will not survive without a healthy, richly diverse planet. The year of COVID has taught us that economies cannot only survive, but flourish when the emphasis is placed on social health and cohesion rather than consumerism. What COVID has also taught us is that people in caring industries are grossly undervalued and underpaid, while those in many professional industries, particularly at the highest level, are grossly overpaid. Neoliberal capitalism has led us into a flawed and dangerous position where those whose income is derived from assets increase their wealth even in periods of crisis, while those whose income is derived from salaries stagnate and share less of the world's wealth. Those with assets enjoy more power and lobby to secure the relative superiority of their assets. Those on wages have no power. Those on wages are susceptible to promises from the wealthy and powerful. The gaudy wrapping paper is attractive, even when those promises or policies make inequality worse. If evidence is required for the statement, look no further than Trump's America. The market should not be unregulated or even minimally regulated, as if potential profit is the only worthy driver. It is clear the market is artificially manipulated by those who short sell and those who bet on currency and other values. Neoliberal economics assumes that all can be and should be privately owned and minimally held in public hands. It is doubtful if many natural assets should any longer be held in private hands with the right to exploit at will. The exploitation of forests should be severely limited. The overselling of water on the Murray-Darling has been a disaster. Water, gas and coal extraction licences should be curtailed, not simply for environmental reasons, nor simply to protect underground water, nor just to protect Indigenous rights, nor just to protect the livelihood of farmers, but because there is now a more economic and technologically superior path to proceed. Finally, politics. There may never have been a time, at least in the memory of those alive today, when politics has been more tribal, more self-serving, less interested in good policy, less committed to long-term reformative strategy, more interested in sectional or party power, more committed to serving sectional interests. This is very bad news for the future of the planet. The reality being that encouraging steps towards a sustainable future have come to fruition not because of politics, but despite politics. It is particularly galling in the circumstances in which we now find ourselves that the Australian Prime Minister publicly frames his stance on the impending threat of global warming in terms of what is in Australia's best interests, as if these interests can be any different to the globe's best interests. Like the COVID pandemic, global warming is a planetary issue from which the plight of everyone is equally threatened and in which every person is equally responsible. It is outrageous that Australia is held captive to the internal party wranglings of the dominant political tribe, even when a considerable majority of the general population wish for more direct action. The tipping point that humanity has now reached means that countries that wish to call themselves democratic must abandon private funding of political parties. The political process must be funded from the public purse pro rata. Only in this way can self-serving interest be endemically eradicated from the political system and good policy become the aim of the political enterprise. So, little frog, I'm afraid you are very much up against it. The tribe at the top of the food chain still believe they can exploit everything without consequence. I would like, however, to finish with a couple of pieces of good news. First, the younger generation at the top of the food chain are much more interested in your future, particularly because they have the wisdom to know that their future is tied to yours and indeed to every other creature. They will not easily be told to go back to school. They know there is little point in an education if the world they are to inherit is severely diminished. They are bringing many of their parents and grandparents along with them, and the mood everywhere, from industry to farmers, insurers to bankers, educators to publishers, is for us to get you out of the heating water that now laps around you. Second, it is dawning on the slow-minded people at the top of the food chain that exploitation and consumerism is a feature of human irresponsible adolescence. That circumstance is forcing humanity to grow up. And as we grow up, we learn there is a better, more satisfying, less alienating, less violent way forward. This has always been the Christian view. What we might call the soul of humanity is infinitely more important than the trinkets with which we like to distract ourselves. If we must choose citizenry of the planet, not citizenry based on nation, ethnicity, or religion. And for those who identify as Christian in this movement, we will rediscover the mission for which we were born, and in which we will rediscover great delight.
Thank you very much, George. We'll wait for questions until David responds. So I now ask Dr. David Hunter, a member of the CES committee, to respond to what Mr. Browning has said. Thank you, David.
Well, thank you, Clive, and thank you, George. That was very good. You know, as far as climate change is concerned, as a Christian, I believe that we have the moral obligation to be part of finding ways to mitigate the problem that we have and reduce the effects of climate change. We need to do it for the common good, for the good of us here in Australia and for the good of the people in the world. But as a scientist, I recognize that there are ways and means of meeting the obligations. Last week, the United Nations Secretary General warned that the world is reaching the point of no return on climate change. Just think about that. Some countries are finally getting serious about it. President Biden has promised to double America's emission reduction target to 50% by 2030, and other countries are following that lead. Canada, Japan, various countries in the European Union, leaving Australia with its unchanged 26 to 28% reduction far behind. The ground has shifted beneath us, and we are morally obliged to step up and meet that standard that has been set. If we do not, it will be done for us, believe me. UK is negotiating a trade with Australia. But only if we reduce our CO2 emissions will we get free trade. Either we increase our emissions targets, or we will pay through a tariff on our exports. Now, as a scientist, I recognize that the evidence is clear. The effects of climate change are already occurring. I'm originally from Canada, and I know that in the Arctic to the north of Canada, the sea ice has melted in the summer. And that is leading to a tipping point. Now, you might have heard that the world temperatures increased by 1 degree Celsius. In the Arctic, it's 4 to 5 degrees Celsius. And that's because when there's ice, the sun comes down and is reflected off. When there's open ocean, the sun comes down and the heat is absorbed. A major tipping point. And the second tipping point that occurs is that there's the melting of the permafrost, which releases methane gas, which then adds even more to this tipping point. And part of that is that in the north, in Greenland, the glaciers are melting. A recent article in the scientific journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Science showed that the melting of the Greenland ice sheet is also nearing a tipping point. So how is that going to affect us? Well, the weather is changing. In Africa, in Asia, including Pakistan, for whom I work as part of the Asian Development Bank, as well as here in Australia, rainfall patterns are changing such that traditional planting times are disrupted, making sustainable food production more and more difficult. Sydney weather will become subtropical, like Brisbane, over the next half century. Isn't that wonderful? Beautiful one day, perfect the next. Except that subtropical weather is characterized by periods of heavy rain and floods from time to time, leading to the widespread flooding of houses on low-lying areas. The second part is the increasing temperatures will lead to our temperate forests being replaced by subtropical forests. And how will that happen? By them being burnt out. So therefore, the houses that are near there will also be burnt. And the houses that are being flooded will also be flooded. And they will be uninsurable from now on. You might have heard that some people were complaining their insurance premiums were $10,000 a year. Well, that's what's going to happen. That's what's going to affect people. You, and especially your children and grandchildren, will be increasingly affected by climate change. But let's not forget there are some good things. Here in Canberra, almost all of our electricity is supplied by renewables now, and the recent United Kingdom report has ranked Canberra the most sustainable city in the world, followed by Madrid. South Australia has set a 50% reduction target by 2030 for emissions, as has Victoria. And speaking of electric vehicles, Victoria is proposing a $3,000 rebate for the purchase of zero-emissions vehicles. And the ACT, the plan is to give free registration for 2 years for electric vehicles. So things are happening. Companies are also investing in renewables. Australia has huge resources. There's the huge sunny deserts. And investors like Andrew Forrest and others are investing in a huge solar farm in the Northern Territory that aims to provide solar electricity to Singapore. And of course, we as individuals can play a part. Recently, the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action Group have urged us to write to our local member, redoing more for climate change, and I have done so. But we can do more ourselves. In our household, over the past dozen years after paying off our mortgage largely, we continued investing in our house to make it greener. We pay the Green 15 surcharge to encourage renewable electricity investment. We installed solar hot water, then solar panels, then switched our heating from gas to electrical because that's renewable. We added extra insulation and double-glazed windows. And now we are downsizing, and we're moving into an apartment with a 7.2 EER rating, so we can do things ourselves. What I'm saying is, we can make a difference. As Stan Grant said in his recent book, with the falling of the dusk, a world in crisis, a change, of course, is still possible. He calls for the recognition of responsibility at all levels, not just by government, not just by companies, but by all of us in our diverse ways can make a small difference where we are. And as part of this responsibility for the environment, I repeat the words of Moses. I set before you this day a choice. And this is the choice. Do right for the good of everyone here in Australia and everyone in the world, or abrogate our responsibility and suffer the consequences. The choice is mine, and the choice is yours.
Thank you very much, David. And I now invite you to ask questions. There's a microphone there, and I would ask that there be questions rather than speeches. So both speakers, I think, have provided us with a wonderful, informed, passionate analysis of climate change. They've presented a problem, but they've also presented a hopeful future, and we need to play a part in that. So I now invite questions from the audience.
Thank you both. That was very challenging. My name is Paul Meyer. When I was growing up, our greatest fear was the nuclear holocaust. Is the challenge any greater now with the climate crisis or even emerging pandemics? Or are we just going through the same thing again?
We might be similar age, so I can quite resonate with it. I also grew up not terrified of this pandemic, but terrified of polio. Lots of people in my class had polio, and maybe you might remember that too.
My brother had.
Yeah, so I think what's different this time is that we face a problem from which there is no escape for anything. Polio and even the nuclear thing hopefully was not totally devastating to absolutely everything, but this is. And the future, it worries me enormously for my children and grandchildren that we have created the world that we've created. And in a way, when the Industrial Revolution started, I don't suppose it dawned on us that the energy that helped the Industrial Revolution was going to cause the problem that it has. But we have known about this since probably 1950s, maybe not clearly then, but certainly since 1970s, we've known the science pretty well. And even a lay person like me became aware of the science from the early 1990s. And I think the thing that worries me so much is that we don't want to do anything about it for the reason I've given really in my paper, that all human beings, at the end of the day, they vote with the economics. And we've been deluded into believing that if we deal with this issue, there is a problem economically. Where in actual fact, I believe the opposite is the truth, that to deal with this problem, we actually have a very good economic future. But because the voices that wish to maintain the status quo are so strong, people are deluded into this continual thing. We can't afford it. A loaf of, what did Barnaby Joyce say, a leg of lamb is going to be $100 or something. This nonsense has consumed people, and somehow or another, we have to deal with the economic issue. If I could just make one other point. We measure success of civilization by economic growth, apart from one country in the world. And economic growth is delivered by forever increasing consumerism and by ever increasing the population. If Australia did not have its migration policy in the last 2 decades, we would have had negative growth. But because we've increased the population very considerably, we have maintained a strong economy. But we can't endlessly keep increasing the population. And so it needs to be dealt with. And I suppose, as I said in my paper, that a cooperative, less competitive, less rival-driven world actually is a better world. And are humans essentially competitive? Or are we essentially cooperative? And we have been led to believe through our economy that we're essentially competitive. But I think deep down we find humanity is best fulfilled through its cooperation.
David, would you like to respond?
In the recent times, I've been convinced. I've been reading Adam Travis in the Canberra Times, and he points out that the doomsayers said that when we stopped this immigration, the Australian economy was going to go into decline. Has it? Our Liberal government is saying how wonderful everything is, and that's with not having an increasing size of the number of people here. So we do not need to have increasing consumerism to have a good economy. And that's going to be essential if we are going to tackle climate change, because we're going to have to do things differently. And those methods are already being done. So that's what we need to do, is get this underway, that we don't have to have continuing immigration and an expanding economy.
Next question. Thank you.
I think it's very clear that we need to radically change our lifestyles and consumption patterns. And we need to go beyond the idea that we can just trade in our old petrol car for a new electric one. I think we have to question whether everybody really needs to have a car, or can we actually share cars? We need a more sharing economy, I think, to share resources that we use. If two people share one car, you're halving the number of cars that you need. So this sharing idea can be transported to all sorts of consumption, including, for example, housing and food. I think if we share things, we have a sharing culture, that will be very important for the planet.
Well, who's going to argue against that? That's absolutely right. One of the difficulties about cars, unfortunately, in Australia is that some of us live in places where it's very difficult to get around unless you've got a vehicle. But I'm one who thinks that we shouldn't actually forever be building new roadways. I think there is a better way of dealing with transport than forever building the roadways. But a shared economy, absolutely. Yeah, and it's partly ours to create. I currently live in a cul-de-sac, and we have a big reserve around us. One lady, 5 doors up, provides the sit-on mower. The next guy down does the mechanics on it. The next guy down buys the petrol for it, and I do the driving on it, which is fun. So it is possible to create a shared, a more sharing, and that's what I mean by the mini-grids, by the way, that I think that it is possible, not only possible, but desirable in the foreseeable future, that we actually don't rely upon a national grid at all, but we actually, energy is created, generated locally and consumed locally.
Yep.
I was thinking both for your address and comments. George, I'd like to pick up on your comment. Capitalism will destroy us unless it's reformed.
Yeah.
And I'm not an economist in any way. William Nordhaus, he got a prize for modelling. Some of his earlier work, back in the late 1970s, I think, was based on a steady state economy. Question, our economy is predicated on growth. And David, I take note of your point. We've done well with fewer people. The economy's booming. How do we get a change, or how do we reform capitalism? Is this in the province of the economists? Are many in that field who might steer us in the right way? It's a big topic, but it seems to drive quite a lot of things. But I agree with your premise.
Yeah.
We need reform.
I don't know whether any of you have heard of a guy called Stuart Rees, Professor Rees in Sydney, or Richard Falk, who's from the States. But both of them were on a webinar yesterday, and I was listening to them last night. And both of them are making the argument that I'm making about neoliberal economics. In the 20th century, communism destroyed a lot of people's lives, and understandably it did, and nobody wants communism. The difficulty is that in the tribal situation in which we find ourselves today, the kind of practice that you're talking about is given a pejorative name. It's called socialism. And one of the reasons why we're in the pickle we're in is because of the labels that are given to things. So Trump's America said it was fighting communism and socialism. Well, give me a break. I mean, and in Australia, there is not a party, certainly not one of the major parties, that is anywhere near socialism, let alone communism. Labour Party certainly isn't. And I think that we need a more reasonable debate about these matters. And the reason why I say that unreformed, the capitalism we have at the moment will destroy us, is because of its assumptions. And I outline those assumptions. One of them being that privatising is always better than things held in public trust. And I think that's a wrong assumption. And that a person who lives on the North Shore of Sydney can own megalitres of water in the Darling Basin, which they can and do, is to me extraordinary. Well, why is that possible? Well, why should that be possible? And I wrote a piece on my blog yesterday about the ABC and its attack. And the ABC is currently being attacked from two quarters. It's being attacked from Murdoch Press, who doesn't believe that a public-owned entity should deliver the news. It believes that private-owned entities should deliver the news. And so it wants it out of the way so it can expand its own empire. And the other reason I was being attacked is because it is trying to call people to account, and we have a government at the moment that doesn't want to be called to account, refuses to be accountable. And I don't think the economists will change the capitalist system we operate on. I don't want there to be communism, but I don't want there to be this form of capitalism, because this form of capitalism inevitably makes certain people winners and others losers, and the numbers who are losers grow all the time, and the numbers who are winners are a very small number. I've forgotten the figures today, but you all know them, that 1% of the population owns some 50% of the wealth, or words to that effect, or worse than that probably. And that 7 individuals in the whole world own more than many total populations of countries. And to have that situation is unsustainable. It won't last. And as most of you know, my other great passion is the Middle East, and particularly Palestine, Israel. And I wish Jews well, but the Israeli government at the moment is actually creating a situation which will blow up, because they're insisting that only 50% of the population in this area have the right to earn an income, and the other 50%, it is their lot to be trodden down and to have a knee on their neck. And to continue that kind of situation, which is neoliberal economics, it means that we will destroy ourselves. That's my point. So go for it, Ross Gittins. Go for it, people of that ilk. We need more people of that ilk, and we need it to be read. The difficulty, I think, is that one shouldn't be disparaging, but not many people think these days. I don't believe. And what people read, occasionally when I go into Mr. Google, I see things that Sky has printed and Fox has printed, etc. And I think to myself, that's